You're listening to the HUD Podcast, the official podcast for the Hudsonian newspaper at Hudson Valley Community College. An HVCC podcast for the students, by the students. Your news now. Get ready to enter the HUD. Hey everybody, what's going on? Welcome back to the HUD, the official podcast for the Hudsonian newspaper at Hudson Valley Community College. Well, folks, we did it. We made it to the final episode of the very first season of our podcast. To conclude this momentous occasion, a number of former editors-in-chief on the paper join us today to discuss their experiences heading the paper. Joining me today to discuss, we have former editors-in-chief of the Hudsonian, John Gray, Anthony Gray, Martin Robinson, Zach Hitt, Pat Garrow, Rebecca Lambertson, Jenny Underhill, Julio Rodriguez, Jay Albright, and Kevin Waltz. Also joining us today is the current editor-in-chief of the Hudsonian, Abigail Navarrete. Gentlemen and gentlewomen, thank you for joining me today. So, and I guess this is a question for all of you, what was it like when you first learned you were going to be editor-in-chief of the Hudsonian? And we'll start with you, John Gray. What was it like for you when you first learned you were going to be editor-in-chief of the Hudsonian?
I'd have to say two things: extremely proud and extremely overwhelmed. I felt like you must feel, well, I did do it once, jumping out of an airplane with a parachute on, very excited, but then realizing, what did I just do? And there's no going back now, and I need to make this work and land on the ground safely. In this case, run the paper well. So it was a bit overwhelming because back when I was there, like 82, 83, 81, 82, in that range, I had a very small staff, only about 7 or 8 core people. So it was a few of us doing a lot of work together. But yeah, just excited and proud, but also wondering if I just bit off more than I could chew. Honestly, that was my first reaction.
I would have to echo what John Gray said. There's that excitement of, you worked for a year or so on the paper in other various capacities, and now you were the one in charge. And then when you get in that office, you start to realize, well, there's a lot that goes along with it, and you just hope that you're gonna, be up to it and be able to do as well as the people that gave you the chance to do that job.
Yeah, as I'm thinking back to it all these years ago, honestly, I think it was a combination of nervousness, excitement, and really anticipation, because one of the last, I'm not sure if this had changed, since, but, one of the last meetings we have is, basically we would elect a new EIC. And, that year, the 2010-2011 academic year at Hudson Valley, I was a freshman. So, I rose up the ranks in the paper and stuff, and I think I did a fairly good job. But, by the time they decided to, vote me in as editor-in-chief, I was, I had a combination of all those feelings, anticipation, nervousness, and excitement and stuff. And then, I really didn't, really feel the full weight of it until, 2 months later, when the next academic year would start. And I actually had to start making decisions on, what the first edition would look like.
It's funny because at the time, and first, I definitely want to agree with John and Anthony. There was that feeling of being proud. There was that excitement. But I think at the time, I also kind of was very overconfident about it. I felt like I was a little bit on top of the world because, you feel that way a lot of times when you're, a young guy at, 18, 19 years old. And very quickly, I learned that, like Anthony said, there's a lot that goes on with this. There's a lot that you have to run, and it's a pretty steep learning curve. Like, even if you watch somebody else do it before you. So although I did feel proud, excited, nervous. I was also like I said, very confident coming into it. I felt like, yes, let's go, let's do this. I got this. I was like born for this role. And like I said, I very quickly learned that, hey, like it's not a walk in the park. This is not an easy job in any sense.
Well, in addition to what's been said, I think there's also sort of a feeling of relief that when you're like early in your young adult professional development process, you're not really sure if you can, rise within organizations and become a professional. So it was definitely a signal to me that I was doing something right, and that things would probably work out for me over time. So it's definitely a formative moment, I think. So
it was interesting. As I mentioned before, we were currently in the fight for our compensation. When I was at Hudson Valley, I was doing fine arts actually, and that was a big draw in my time. So accepting the editor-in-chief position after I ran for it was also interesting. But I mean, it was a lot of excitement, kind of like Martin said. The moment I first actually realized it was when the editor-in-chief before me, Matthew Whalen, left the gavel on my desk. And that was pretty cool. It was like, oh crap, this is actually happening. And just having to plan everything out. It was a lot of meeting with the student senate for the compensation, trying to rally our ranks and figure everything out. But I mean, it was a great experience, and so I can't complain.
I was actually very proud because I had felt very insecure that the e-board the year before me did not have confidence. They did not think that I could handle dealing with the Senate well. They did not feel that, I guess there were other aspects of being the role that they felt I didn't fit. And I remember immediately feeling determined to prove all of them wrong and show that, I like to be fun and I like to be silly, but I actually can be incredibly mature and I know a lot about this business. So that was, it was proud. I was happy that I finally had been elected in to do it. And I had that drive immediately that I am going to, like, this is my baby and I'm gonna give it all of my love and I want to take us to as good as we can get.
Similarly to everything that was said, I was really excited because in the year previous, the Hudsonian had just become home to me. And when I first came to Hudson Valley, it was like a struggle to meet people. And that was just a channel through which I met like really close friends that I still talk to today. So being able to come onto the e-board and then to be able to be the e-board's leader was something that I felt really passionately about. So I was so excited to do. And that's really just echoed through the entirety of my administration. We also had a full e-board for the first time in a very long while. So I felt very excited about being able to work with all of these people that I'd grown so close to in that year.
Just completely motivated, really, just to see what we'd be able to accomplish, to see, different tasks that we'd tackle together. Yeah, just motivated.
Well, it was kind of, I was in a lot of kind of disbelief that I had actually gotten to that point in the paper because I had kind of just joined on a whim that year. And I just never thought that by the end of the year I would be being voted in as EIC. But definitely though, when I was voted in, I had this, like said before, I had this real sense of pride about it, but also like the weight of the world was now on my shoulders. Because as managing editor, I had kind of seen firsthand some of the things that the EIC has to deal with, and I was kind of, figuring out a way to brace myself to deal with that.
So initially, of course, there's a strong sense of pride. You're really proud of yourself that you were able to accomplish this thing that you were working towards, and it's very exciting. However, as soon as the election is over, it was like on to the next thing. As soon as elections were over, the e-board was really small, and Rachel had kind of warned me for that. And right after elections ended, she kind of gave me an agenda of people to contact. And so immediately I was already like jumping into the politics of it, and at the same time trying to figure out what changes needed to be applied to the Hudsonian because of COVID. And so that kind of fueled us moving into creating more virtual pieces, such as our podcast.
John, you've obviously had an extensive career, and you've said in the past that the Hudsonian was the first time you ever saw your name in print. How has the Hudsonian shaped your career?
Oh, it's shaped it greatly in that you have to, first of all, learn how to organize and work on a deadline, a real deadline. Up until that point, if you hand in a paper late, maybe you can schmooze the teacher. Maybe you can live with the C minus or the B. You would have had an A, but you were 2 days late with it. With the Hudsonian, it was like, if it's due on Friday, it's due on Friday. People are looking for it. Advertisers are looking for it. It's all on you. So it was good in terms of having to organize, also managing people a little bit, managing expectations, even for yourself. And it taught me some ethics as well. As I'm listening to the other editors talk, I remember a case where a student was going to hurt themselves in a car, and the police had it surrounded. And it ended up, he didn't have a gun, and everything he was just having a bad day. But it caused a commotion. I remember I was the reporter going to cover it, and the chief of police on the campus pulled me aside, who I had a good relationship with, and said, you print this kid's name, you're going to probably wreck his life. And to say, he was going to hurt himself. And so, I had to make a decision of how do I report this without maybe hurting the student, but also doing my job. And I was 18 years old, 19 years old when I had to make that kind of determination. And I had to grow up fast, if you know what I'm saying. And that kind of decision you end up making throughout your career as a journalist. I've been doing this now since I got out of college, where I get paid for it, since 1985. So those decisions never go away. The human side of reporting and being an editor as well. So it taught me all of it. It really did. And even managing a budget, I never had a budget before in my life other than my paper route, or you make money at Price Chopper, you go spend it. Now all of a sudden I've got this budget, and are we buying this or are we buying that? And if you're not careful, you'll run out of money before May. So all of it all helped in every aspect.
Anthony, when you were editor-in-chief, the Student Senate controversially shut down the Hudsonian for a time. What happened there, and how did you overcome that?
There was some conflict between, I would say the paper, but it's probably me and the student council, pretty much from like the first or second month of the paper. Their expectations seemed to be that the Hudsonian existed as a means of promoting good public relations for the college, especially for the student population that we serve. And I didn't see that. I didn't really think of it as a club the way they wanted to view it. I saw it as a newspaper, maybe not the Times Union or the Troy Record, but, we tried our best to, actually talk about things that were interesting to our readers. It came to a head almost in January or February when I forget the name of it, but there was a so-called gentleman's club in Clifton Park. The guy who owned it had he graduated from Hudson Valley, and he wanted to run an ad on the back page. It was a full page ad asking female students that wanted to earn almost like $1,000 a week apply there. you know, it's kind of like ambivalent whether that was such a good idea, but it was a full page ad, and the ad money is always useful. The advertising manager at the time was female, and I asked her how she felt about it. I don't know if it was in person or if it was one of the weekly meetings, but she said that she was fine with it. And even though he denied it afterwards, the advisor for the Hudsonian at the time, I forget his name, he was an English professor. He, you know, he didn't object. I don't remember if he agreed to it, or he said he didn't think it was right. He might have said that he didn't think it was right, but he didn't say that we couldn't. So I said, well, it's illegal. It's not my job to be the censor. If society doesn't want establishments like that, then they should get the legislature to ban them. So for asking me to censor what's a legal product, you know, it's kind of a backdoor way of, you know, making it and run against the First Amendment. So I took the guy's ad. He was supposed to run 2 issues. It ran in 1, and then they shut us down because Mr. Hathaway, Scott Hathaway was the guy's name. He was the advisor. He resigned as advisor, and then the administration says, well, you don't have an advisor, so you can't be a club, and they shut us down. They locked the doors, and you know, a lot of ensuing publicity, and they reached out and suggested a compromise. I mean, I wasn't going to give the guys money back. I had, you know, he had signed a contract. You know, we had published the first ad, and we were prepared to publish the second ad. The school didn't want us to, and that was why they shut us down, because I would not publish the second one. And then you know, we got a lot of calls from a lot of different people. But eventually that they worked it out to where the student council would pay the guy back. He made a request to not run the second ad. Student council said, you know, in order to make him whole, they would refund him the money out of their budget. So I said, well, I'm okay with that. That's his decision. I just want to make sure that we don't have to, you know, we were ready to honor our side of the bargain. You know, we wouldn't let him out of the contract, just like we wouldn't expect to be let out of the contract either. And as long as the contract was honored, I was okay with that. So once that was worked out, they, you know, unlocked the doors and let us go back to work.
Martin, I'll turn back to you. You were the first African-American man to ever serve as editor-in-chief of the Hudsonian. What was it like to make history in that regard?
To be completely honest with you, I knew it was kind of history making, but you know, it was something that I didn't entirely want to brag about because it was something that I couldn't necessarily verify because you know, the Hudsonian spans all the way back to I think the 50s when, you know, Hudson Valley, you know, was, you know, it became a community college and stuff. So I wasn't sure about the, you know, veracity of this, but I knew that, you know, I definitely was the first, you know, Black editor-in-chief in a, if not the first, but in a very long time. And I did try to take that role seriously and stuff. And, you know, I think through recruiting different people, trying to recruit a diversity of voices and stuff, I think I tried to include a number of different perspectives in the newspaper to cover all aspects of student life.
Zach, when you were editor-in-chief, you learned about a number of kidnappings on campus and reported on them. How did you discover that information, and what was it like having to report on that?
So it's funny because, well, it's not funny. It's very interesting because there was a story about a kidnapping, and there was a story about a near assault that was kind of stopped, kind of not stopped. Basically, to my recollection, what happened was a young student was kidnapped by, I believe, her significant other, and the school essentially knew about it and didn't tell the student body. They didn't warn anybody, obviously when you have a dangerous person on campus or a situation like this, the first thing you would want to do is say, hey, like this happened. That was my thinking, at least. So I was contacted by somebody kind of close to the situation, who basically said, hey, this happened. You're the editor-in-chief of the paper. Please help. So we ended up running a story. The administration of the school definitely expressed their dissatisfaction at the fact that we had put this out there. There was also another story where a student pulled a knife on another student. Whether, what the situation was extremely unclear, but that student happened to be the vice president of the student council. So the school in both situations didn't release any information that this had even happened. They were unclear about details. Obviously, they didn't want to release witness names, and I totally understand that. But they didn't even want to be forthcoming to the school. So when we found out about both situations, the immediate first step was to be like, hey, let's gather all the info we can about this. Students do need to know this is important. We can't let this go untouched, untalked about. So we ended up running stories about that. Like I said, the administration of the school really expressed their dissatisfaction about this. They made it very clear that they weren't interested in helping. And we ended up, I ended up in meetings with, the vice president of the school. And they were very, like I said, they were very unhappy about it. And in some ways I could see where they were coming from. Obviously, if you're the school in this situation, this doesn't look good for anybody. It's not good PR. People don't want to know, or people don't want to put out there that, hey, a student got kidnapped. People don't want to put there about, hey, there's a violent incident on campus. But if you're the editor-in-chief in this situation, you have to make that decision to say, hey, I still need to do my job. I still need to do the right thing here. My job is to inform the students in the community about what's going on in campus. I think somebody else said, when it comes to informing the student body about what's going on campus, John said, you do really have to make certain ethical decisions at times. And it's something that, as like an 18-year-old, it's hard to make those decisions. It's hard to know what to do. But I am proud of how we handled it. And it definitely was extremely formative for how to deal with a difficult situation.
Pat, you were previously creative editor before becoming editor-in-chief. What was it like making the jump from that position to the top position at the paper?
Well, I think I took the role as creative editor mostly because it was just an opening, and I was mostly a news writer kind of guy, some opinion, and our opinion editorial stuff was in the creative section at that time. So unlike Zach and maybe some other people, I wasn't like inclined toward like the music scene or other things that naturally fall into the creative section. I just kind of took it because it was there, but it gives you, a baseline sense of, managing a stream of content on a week-to-week basis, being responsible for a few pages of the paper. Since it wasn't maybe like a natural fit for me, it was also nice to broaden my thinking on what goes into the paper, which helped once I became EIC in having a sense of what that section should be. So yeah, I think any editorial experience can be useful when, going and becoming EIC, and it served its purpose for me being the creative editor for, I think, a semester.
Now, Rebecca, during your time as EIC of the Hudsonian, the Student Senate attempted to take compensation away from Hudsonian members. What was that like, and how did you solve through that?
So during my time, we had some difficulties with the Student Senate. There was a lot of disagreement over this issue specifically. I actually inherited the problem from the previous year. That was really something that they were trying to do the year before, and they didn't have the votes in the Student Senate. So I knew going into it that this was going to be an issue. Honestly, it was, I don't know how it was handled after me. I know that from when I was talking to Jenny a little bit, that the next Student Senate was a little more on board with the idea of us getting compensated. The reason that they wanted to take it away was because they didn't feel that the paper had a wide enough reach. So our strategy was kind of focusing on rallying student support, which we did with some success, as well as just really, I focus on building as positive a relationship I could with Alfredo and the Student Senate members, and really just handling it as best we could. I mean, when you go into college, you have limited experience, you know what I'm saying? So we were all just really trying to do the best we could and stick together as a team through this. And I mean, we were successful because you guys still get paid. So I'm very happy for that.
Now, Jenny, you've said in the past that the Hudsonian is one of the best college experiences you've ever had. Why is that?
I would wrap it up and say the friendships. I still communicate with a majority of the people that I knew, even from my first year on the Hudsonian. I think that when you have the ability to be with people that have similar interests, it's very exciting. But I can't even imagine what college would have been for me without being on the Hudsonian. I mean, it was all of my memories that I really have of going to Hudson Valley involved being in that office. That was my happy space. That was my safe space. That was my, when I want to feel good, I'm going to come in here, I'm going to get my work done, and I'm also going to see my friends. Like, it was just so wholesome and so positive. I never felt like I got along better with a group of people than I did as when I was in college. And I have more friends now that I communicate with from the Hudsonian than I have ever from high school or middle school or growing up. I mean, the amount of time that we all spent together, like the blood, sweat, and tears that we put in, and we all had to drive to do the same thing. We want to create the best newspaper that we can, and we want to do it together. I really felt like we had a very wholesome family vibe when I was EIC, and that's something that was very important to me, was that I wanted everyone to feel comfortable. I wanted everyone to be happy. I wanted people to get their work done, but I wanted them to take control of what they were doing, and I wanted them to enjoy it, because we're here to make a product, but we're also here to have fun.
Julio, I found a quote from your last article. It said, "Here's a little piece of advice. Do not allow fear of failure to deter you from a new and unknown opportunity. Understand that failure is sometimes inevitable, but it can also be enriching." What were some of your biggest fears as editor-in-chief?
Biggest fears? I think I've always been a very introverted person. I'm very quiet, and so taking on the role was a big step for me, especially public speaking. I remember some of our first meetings, I was like legitimately shaking, like standing up in our weekly meetings, but then gradually that just like sort of evaporated, and I was very much more personable, and I was able to connect with people, and I think that benefited the paper because people were able to see me as approachable, and in that sense there was just a like camaraderie that developed, and people were more inclined to go to the office and hang out in the office, and I think that's something that we really cultivated well with our administration and our e-board. In terms of other fears, I think that one of the greatest was that we would lose a lot of editor positions. I remember while I was creative editor in the previous year, we lost a lot of people, and I was very fearful that I was going to have to take on all of those roles. And it sort of did happen, but I had a lot of support from the layout editor and the managing editor, so it wasn't as big of an issue as I first thought it would be. And I think a lot of the fears that I had were pretty much eliminated when I was in the position because I had so much support from the managing editor and the layout editor. They really made sure that when I was feeling stressed that they were a crutch I could lean on, and they were there for me in a lot of those instances when we had high stakes article to write, or we had an interpersonal conflict with someone who was a staff writer, a staff photographer, or even an editor. So just a lot of those fears that I initially had were eliminated just through the support.
Now, Jay, before you became EIC, I understand there was a bit of controversy that happened with the previous editor-in-chief right before you. Could you please explain to us what happened there and how was that resolved?
Controversy. I don't know if there was really controversy. I think that the Hudsonian is made up by essentially its members. And we had a leader that was not leading, I guess, the way that most of its members wanted the paper to be run. So, yeah. Then, of course, we have elections, and I was fortunate enough to be supported by essentially the entire Hudsonian staff, and yeah.
Now, Kevin, you were managing editor when Jay was editor-in-chief, and I understand that you often overtook some of the EIC responsibilities during his time. You also became editor-in-chief after Jay graduated. Did Jay give you any advice when you became EIC?
Well, I think I learned a lot from Jay just by being managing editor. And there was this one time in particular when Jay was on vacation in Florida, and I kind of took over the reins for the week that he was gone. And we had an issue with a certain student housing facility near the school that an article was written about and a quote was misattributed. And we met with the higher up managers at the company that ran this facility, and they tried using that as a as kind of a way to try and get us to totally rewrite the whole article in a light that that portrayed them in a better light, because a lot of students had some negative things to say about this specific facility. And that kind of spiraled into this like whole dramatic thing, I guess, that kind of ended up bordering into like them kind of harassing the paper, and that was kind of dealt with with the administration. But I think definitely as managing editor, I learned a lot about some things that would, the EIC would potentially have to deal with, and things like that. So I think, yeah, I definitely learned a lot under Jay, and also seeing the things that he had to deal with as well as that kind of stuff. So I guess, yeah.
Abigail, with the COVID-19 pandemic, the Hudsonian has largely had to transition to a more virtual environment. How has it been like so far having to deal with this unique event?
So COVID has complicated things a lot. Not to mention, we started the semester with a smaller e-board than I would have liked. We had 3 e-board, including myself. And beyond that, we together we launched the podcast, which was a very successful endeavor for the Hudsonian. However, we did have to we ran into some trouble with student activities because our current constitution does not allow virtual works to be compensated. We managed to come to a compromise so that we could publish articles on our website and receive we came to a compromise so that we could publish articles on our website and receive compensation for that. However, the podcast is still uncompensated, which is something that we are hoping to change this semester with rewriting the Constitution. So it's already been approved by eBoard. It's going to be moved to the general Hudsonian next week, and then following that, it'll go to Student Senate. But we're all optimistic that this will allow the future Hudsonian to we're optimistic that this will allow future Hudsonian to follow any projects that they intend to do. For example, in 2012 we had a YouTube channel. Now, with rewriting the Constitution, broadcast productions such as podcasts, YouTube channels, and whatever else, short films that we intend to present to the public can now be compensated through student activities should this Constitution be approved.
The next question is also for everyone, and you can take turns going around and answering it once again. And that question is this: what was the hardest obstacle you faced as editor-in-chief, and how did you overcome it? Again, we'll start with John.
I would say my most challenging moment was at the time there was a student president of the student senate who, in my opinion, had a very big ego, and he again back then the Hudsonian was literally on the other side of the glass from where the student senate was. I don't know if that's changed over the years, but they were you could look through the glass and see them, and he wanted us to print articles that anything that they did were, well, here, we'll feed you the story and tell everybody how great this is that we did this or we did that. And I think I wrote an editorial he didn't like about something they were doing. I couldn't tell you in a million years what it was, but he wanted it changed and I wouldn't change it. And he went to, the advisor to the paper, and they said, it's an editorial, it's opinion, it's clearly marked that way. It's fair what he wrote. And so then he put newspapers, he took the Hudsonia and put newspapers up on the glass, taped it to all the windows so we couldn't see in the Senate anymore. It was kind of childish, and, people on my end of my staff were like, well, what are we going to do? Are we going to tape? I said, no, we're not going to do anything. But it was more dealing with my first brush with a politician who didn't like something you wrote, so to speak, even though he was a student. He was an older student too. He was in his early 30s, and he was the student senate president and very involved on campus. And so I think he thought he was always the smartest person in the room, and maybe he was most of the time. But so that was probably the most challenging thing, having somebody act that way and come after me and try to get me in trouble with my boss, so to speak, over something I wrote, and having the wherewithal to not, the knee-jerk response is, I must have done something wrong, let me fix it. I looked at what I wrote and said it's fair, and I don't want to change it just because he's mad. And I had to deal with the fact that now somebody was mad at me, and some of the people who were under him were probably not happy with the Hudsonian. And you're not going to always make friends when you run a newspaper or you write for a newspaper, and nobody tells you that in journalism class. You may have people not wave back hello when you walk by them in the hallway. So that was probably the most challenging thing at that age, 18, 19. Because everybody wants to be liked, and suddenly I wasn't liked, and they were acting out against me. But it all blew over eventually, and he's probably still mad at me 40 years later. But that was his personality, so I'll just have to live with his derision.
As challenging as the whole, lockdown of the paper by the administration was, I actually think that the more challenging one was when Ellen Evans, who was the news editor at the time, wanted to investigate the pricing of textbooks in the student store, there's a lot of fierce opposition from the faculty student administration as well as the student council and the college administrators. Had to really get up to speed on the law regarding access to public records, whether things like the invoices of textbooks were public record, who would legitimately expect to be able to have access to those, and how to navigate that whole process, get the information that we needed to be able to run the story that we wanted to run. A woman named Ann Caruso was the head of the FSA at the time. And she basically stonewalled, saying that, the invoices for the student textbooks weren't matters of public record. And the college pretty much backed her up. So I ended up, filing what's called an Article 78 proceeding, which is, it's not really a lawsuit. It's just you're going to a court and asking the court to force a public agency or official to do their job or to obey the law. And we were able to do that because we got a favorable advisory opinion from the Committee on Open Government for the New York State Department of State. Robert Freeman, I think, was the guy's name. And he'd been there since they, Watergate, basically, when New York State said, we got to, add some transparency to our government to, make people feel better about things. So he'd been doing a job for a long time, and he agreed that, those invoices should be a matter of public record. The FSA was funded primarily by student fees and profits generated from, student operations on campus, which is totally funded by, public funding. It was a hassle getting the money for the filing fee, but I was surprised that the student council actually went along with it. Turned out that their thought was, well, they'll let it go because by the time the case actually came up for a hearing before a judge, their argument was, well, I was no longer a student at the school, therefore the point was moot. The judge didn't agree with them, and in the end ordered the FSA to disclose the invoices to the Hudsonian. The editor for the next year was Michael Baker. I'm not really sure how much follow-up there was. I saw one article. I asked him about it. He said there was a lot of pressure, so I guess that continued. So long story short, I'm sorry, I'm a rambler. I probably should have said that at the beginning. Yeah, there was a lot of animosity. The school didn't appreciate that, because it was one thing to have a disagreement about, who had control of the editorial content in the newspaper, whether a student newspaper was actually a legitimate news organ or whether it was a club that was subject to the control of the college. That was kind of philosophical. But now we're talking about their money, and people don't like when you mess with their money. There's millions of dollars that go through that bookstore that the FSA is able to direct things. So yeah, I'd say that was the hardest thing.
It was kind of a bit of a mix of a bureaucratic challenge and stuff, and it did involve the student senate as well. So the thing is that the paper, there was always the background issue of us being compensated. I mean, Rebecca, I'm not that surprised that, that would come up as an issue, because that's kind of been in the background when I was the editor-in-chief, because there were a lot of people, in the student senate that wasn't exactly a fan of us being the only group, where, members are compensated and having the largest budget in the student senate. So we ended up coming up with this issue where basically we were spending money, we were spending our regularly allocated money, and we were starting to run out of that money, in terms of, spending on meetings and going to conferences and that sort of thing, so that by the time spring semester came, the allocated portion of our money was, really dry. And at the same time, we had thousands and thousands of dollars, tens of thousands of dollars in ad revenue that just was not untouched. So the rationale being was that we couldn't touch that money because that money was not specifically allocated to us, even though the paper fairly generated that money through, selling ads to, different colleges and other folks interested in, buying ad space in the paper. So it took, me coming to a few student senate meetings and, having discussions with the student senate president who, at the time, we both had shared some political science classes and, maintained a, pretty good relationship. One thing I will say is that unlike, previous unlike previous EICs and, previous student senates, we actually had a fairly good relationship. And we were able to eventually work that out, and we were able to gain access to our ad revenue. And, we continued, once we got that secured, we were able to keep building upon the paper and stuff.
So I definitely had a few different challenging moments. First, I'd definitely like to say that I had a really good team, I feel. Particularly the copy editor, Fatima Hussein. She was a wizard with, the English language, writing, and just a very kind and intelligent person. I also had Randy Hammond as the sports editor. He was extremely knowledgeable, he was focused, he was diligent, and both of them became kind of my anchors. As far as, when I did have challenging moments, I really could go to them, and they would kind of be like my counsel. And in a lot of ways, every moment of being on the Hudsonian was challenging in a different way, whether, like some of you guys have talked about, interpersonal conflicts, or whether it was a challenge with the administration, something like that. I would say that the kind of the number one thing, though, I would say two, actually. One would definitely be that kidnapping story, that, that the threat story where you kind of suddenly realize that, hey, there are other interests at play here, just politically. And if somebody does not want you to write something, if they don't want it to be published, they will do everything in their power to stop you, everything that they possibly can. So I'd say that was one challenging moment. The other challenging moment that was difficult for me on a very personal level was that we had a turnover with a key member of the staff, with the managing editor, the year where I realized, to my own fault, and I'll admit that, I'd really kind of tasked the wrong person with being in the position that they were at. And we ended up having to let them go off the paper. And this was a person who I considered to be a friend. So, and still do to this day. But, sometimes just because you're friends or you collaborate well together or you have interesting creative discussions doesn't mean that you work together well as number one and two. Sometimes you can clash. There's different types of personalities. So yeah, like I said, I mean, the one challenge was definitely, kind of being called to the carpet by the administration, throwing down like that. And the other was definitely, the interpersonal challenges you learn when it comes to the Hudsonian. I think one of the biggest things you learn about is politics and like how they work in general, like in a very specific, close to home sense. You really realize how much that can affect your day-to-day life. Like John said, when it's real when somebody won't talk to you in the hallway anymore.
A lot of things that have crossed my mind parallel what everyone else has said. The interpersonal stuff is super challenging when you've got conflict between the staff or someone's not doing your job and you have to have a tough conversation. I felt like I was in the role because I could string coherent sentences together. I wasn't a psychologist or anything like that. Those were tough. But to go in a different direction and bring something new, I guess one thing that popped into my mind was once ran a cover article about like I don't know, a talent show or something, and so we accidentally left in like an outdated draft that wasn't the final copy edited draft. So it had all of these mistakes in it, including like brackets saying in all caps, like insert quote here and stuff like that. And it read as if it was just totally mocking the talent show. And the student senate was like super offended by it because they thought it was like we were calling the whole thing a farce. And the difference between that and a lot of these other things is like that was totally my fault. Like I had to catch that before it hit the press or whatever. So it was a different sort of challenge, having to really like own a big mistake, you know, a cover article that went just totally sideways, and having to walk into a room and be like, yeah, that was all my fault. I'm sorry. Like what can we do from here to you know, make sure that this relationship isn't entirely damaged. So I think when you're in charge of it and learning how to take like ultimate responsibility for things for the first time as a young person, I found that to be a big challenge.
I mean, it was probably the compensation issue. Martin says that they had a good relationship with the student senate. That was not really the case for us, unfortunately. Despite efforts on the parts of, I mean, both sides tried to work it out a little bit, but it just wasn't clicking because we didn't agree on the core issue of us getting compensated. So it was mainly that, and just staffing. I mean, it's always been a challenge, despite the fact that paper members do get compensated. It's always been a challenge to just maintain a full staff. We never had a full staff, and just have enough people to actually keep the paper going at the rate that we did. But I mean, the experience still stands that it was a great time. And I mean, it's a great resume bullet. So all of the challenges really just make you better. So it was a good experience.
The student senate, we saved keeping compensation by 1 vote, which they actually later disclosed to me that it technically did not count. They had technically elected a person off of the Senate that had voted in favor of us keeping our compensation, which obviously the compensation issue was very at its peak when I was transitioning into being editor-in-chief. That was very, very stressful. I was lucky that I had a very good relationship with the vice president, and I had a pretty good relationship with the president. And that was something that I felt like was very important to me as EIC, because I felt like watching the relationship between the Senate and the e-board of the Hudsonian, it was very combative, and I didn't want that. I didn't think there was actually a need for that. I didn't think it needed to end up being a, you know, a fighting match, cursing back and forth at each other because we couldn't agree. I wanted us to just be adults and figure out what we were going to do. So I was actually glad that I was able to have the relationship with them that I did. And I felt like it made it a lot more peaceful, but it took a while to make it peaceful. There is a long history of the Senate and the Hudsonian not getting along. That goes years and years way before me. But I think that was probably the most difficult thing I dealt with, was having the weight on my shoulders, that knowing that if at any point I said or did something wrong, they could potentially swoop in and say, hey, actually, we're going to take all of this away from you. We're going to remove compensation for your people. We're going to do all of this. And I actually put a lot of my effort into making sure that my staff was protected, and that staff got their pay, because while we were in the transition process, they came down and had said that you could not, if you received financial aid, that you could not have compensation that surpassed what you had for financial aid. And that actually affected two members on my e-board, that one of which had admitted that he would use some of that money to keep electricity on in the house with their parents. So I had a really hard time with that. And I remember actually going back and forth, being really stressed out, just trying to make sure that the payment was given, specifically because they had passed this weeks after we had released, I don't remember how many issues, let's call it 8 issues now. So now we're saying that this is 8 issues in which my editors believe that they are getting paid for their work. And now you are saying that you are not going to pay for work that has already been done. That was very stressful. I remember that actually being one of the last things I did as editor-in-chief was calling one of my members of the e-board to let him know that he had his paycheck. But the compensation and the Senate, I think we were lucky. I think a peaceful relationship with the Senate was necessary. I remember before I was editor-in-chief, if there was a member of the e-board that would attend the Senate meeting when they were discussing something about the Hudsonian, it could get hostile kind of quickly. I remember when they were voting on our budget, that before they voted, which that was stressful too. I remember having to negotiate with them about how, because they were cutting budgets on everything, and I wish I could remember the numbers correctly, but they were gonna take, I want to guess maybe like 10,000 from our budget, and I remember having to negotiate back and forth, but it being proper, and that we had come to a very clean conclusion. Rachel approved, and at that meeting when they voted on it, everyone looked at me if I wanted to speak, but I didn't feel that I needed to, because we had all agreed prior in a meeting. I mean, any time we would deal with the Senate, not even being editor-in-chief, it was stressful. But I think that was the most difficult thing, because I also had the weight on me and in my brain of the people the year ahead of me, thinking that I was going to, my relationship with the Senate or whatever I would do would lead to the Hudsonian crashing and burning. When actually I think I handled it better than I thought I could have. And it actually ended up being very positive and protecting the Hudsonian, which was my number one concern.
I think a lot of what's been said really resonated with me. There were a lot of interpersonal conflicts, a lot of conflicts with Student Senate and funding and student activities. But I think as editor-in-chief specifically, my greatest challenge was with an article. A student had alleged against another student that she had been raped by him. And so we obviously had to report on it. And I remember just feeling like immense pressure to do it well and to be respectful of all of the parties involved. So dealing with that just resulted in a lot of meetings with Rachel. And I remember I co-wrote it with the managing editor. So being able to have someone there to be able to just act as a buffer and also like go over what would be appropriate and what would be inappropriate questions to ask the victim, because we had to interview her and it was just a very heavy topic to be dealing with as a 19-year-old college student who hasn't really dealt with any of these issues in my own personal life before. So that was definitely the greatest challenge I had. And it was also a test in my ability to manage interpersonal conflicts as well, because there were 2 staff writers who really wanted to take on the story, but because it was such a high stakes article, we had to make sure that it was going to come from like people on the editorial board, and that just wasn't agreeing with them. So they felt very inclined to go after the story. And so the managing editor and I had to deal with that and try to make sure that we were making sure that they were feeling heard and that their concerns were valid about our reporting, but that it was ultimately going to be produced by us because we were at the helm of the organization at the time.
Challenging moment. I think everything that happened when it happened was, it felt like, you know, it was gonna be the straw that would break the camel's back, but just overall managing 40 people, because at one point that's, you know, that was the whole population of the Hudsonian, between editors, staff writers, photographers. You know, we had so many people packed into one room, and just feeling the pressure of wanting to be a good leader, being supportive, being a good editor. I just tried to take it, you know, as seriously as I could, and just be a good example. So just, yeah, just having that much pressure of, you know, making sure I was a solid resource for every one of those individuals.
Well, as EIC, there's a lot of challenging stuff, you know, be it general turnover rates or, you know, just the challenges of running a newspaper at a community college. But by far, I think for me, the biggest challenge that I had was interpersonal issues within the office. And something I think that I think a lot of people here would agree with me about running Hudsonian is really, with the budget you have, essentially you're running a small business in an office space, and you have the same type of problems that you would get like in an office work environment. But when I was EIC and we had one individual on the inside the e-board who throughout the majority of the year was part of some sort of all these different interpersonal issues. And it came to the point where once they also started to kind of slack on their job a bit, we had to take the termination steps that were in the Constitution. And from my understanding, it was the first time that we actually had to truly go through with them. And in the Hudsonian, it's a trial process. So if an editor is to be dismissed, there has to be a trial on the e-board, and it has to get a 2/3 vote of the e-board. And I ultimately made the decision to go through with this because many people on the e-board had expressed that they were no longer comfortable in the newsroom to me. And that, you know, as EIC, you do have to also look after, you know, the well-being of the paper and also the individuals on it. So we went through the process, and then the editor in question ended up surviving by 1 vote. And that was probably the toughest moment of, you know, my time as EIC, because then for the week that followed, I had to deal with the aftermath of trying to vote to remove somebody and then having that person survive it. But it ended up being resolved because that person kind of doubled down on their antics that led me to make this decision, and then we were able to successfully remove them the next week. So that was definitely the hardest thing I ever had to deal with, was the whole trial process in front of the whole club and all that, basically acting as a prosecutor, you know, for in a club environment. You know, it's that was tough, but it was resolved, so a lot better.
So I would say that the Hudsonian this semester has managed to have, I would say that the Hudsonian this semester has managed to essentially avoid controversy. The reason for that mostly being is that there's been a lack of news articles and a surplus of creative articles. And we've been very short-staffed this semester, so we've been functioning with 3 e-board members, managing social medias, publishing, writing articles, dealing with budget, compensation, and at the same time, we're trying to recruit, and students are much more unwilling to attend meetings when they're via Zoom. So while a normal semester would I have 20 people, including e-board, suddenly we're barely able to have 10. So I would say the hardest part for me as EIC was trying to figure out how to start this semester online only. I had to ask myself some questions like, is it possible for the newspaper to function? How will the layout editor work? Is it worth publishing and bringing newspapers to campus? If we publish online, will student activities agree to compensate? And so the first 3 weeks of the semester, we didn't publish at all. It was just me meeting with people and just really trying to delve out the basics and figure out what was possible for us during the pandemic. So now that it's like official, we're going to be remote through spring as well. This has kind of become our new normal, which is meeting over Zoom and focusing on the podcast and publishing online. However, I would like to add that after a very slow and difficult semester, we did manage to build an e-board, and we will be having elections for 4 positions next week, which for me it was kind of a solution to the struggles that I was feeling earlier this semester.
And we'll turn back to John. John, you are an anchor for News 10. What's it like transitioning from just writing for a newspaper to actually starring on the air every night?
Well, it's interesting. There's 2 answers to that. Initially, years ago, it was time. With broadcast, you have to turn things very quickly. I worked in radio before TV and then TV for 30 years. You were on a story, you had to turn it within a few hours and get it on the air, where with a newspaper, you may have had some extra time if it didn't run until the next day. That was 20 years ago. Now, newspapers are in the same boat with TV, with social media and websites, where they also have to turn it very quickly. So there's no luxury in a newspaper anymore where, I can cover this thing at 11 a.m. and I have until, 5 o'clock to get a story done. Your editor is going to be saying, I need this up on the site right now. So time is one of the things that, initially was a big difference, but that's kind of gone away. I've always felt with TV, it's been easier because there's less space to fill, and you can get away with not giving every detail that you need to put in there with a newspaper article. There's just an expectation with newspapers where you're going to give more detail on a story. So it's always been more of a challenge, I think, for newspaper reporters, and that will never change. Where TV reporters filing a story that runs 70 seconds, they don't have to get into every nitty-gritty thing that a newspaper reporter has to often. So I always tip my hat to newspaper reporters. I think their jobs are a bit harder. They don't have to blow dry their hair and look good on camera, but they've got to do a lot more heavy lifting in terms of putting detail into a story. That to me is the biggest difference. And I've done both, and I enjoy both. It's challenging no matter what you do, because with journalism, what troubles me most is people confuse just people who writing a blog or people sharing things with journalism, and they don't understand what you do as editors and what you're learning in school right now. If you're in school for this, you're held to a higher standard in terms of what you'll print, and people they've blurred the lines where they compare what we do with Joe Schmo, who just happens to write something but never vets it, never checks sources, and it starts getting shared around the internet when it's not even accurate, and that's kind of a problem.
Anthony, you were EIC in 2000 at the turn of a new millennium, at a time when internet was largely in its infancy. How big of a factor did the internet play in your time as EIC, and how did the Hudsonian deal with technology at the time?
Y2K was the big concern because obviously computers and technology was still kind of a new thing, and nobody was really sure how that whole change over to the 00s, a lot of people thought that there was going to be the end of the world, right? We had email. In fact, I still have the Gmail account for HUDED too, for Gmail, for being a Hudsonian editor. So it made communication a little easier. We weren't totally reliant on telephones. Cell phones were not the big thing at that point. So it was still the landline phones with an answer. So we definitely increased the communication between us and the student body. And it was also easier to reach out to people that we were looking for information to help write a story, or even advertisers for that matter. Did want to have a web page, but the student council and the administration shot that down, and turned out that was something they had control over. We were using the school, the computer and the internet access came through Hudson Valley, so they have control over how you use them to a certain extent. So while they couldn't really say much about what we wrote, they were able to block us from having a web page. YouTube was not a thing at the time, so that was never really a question. Nobody had ever heard of a podcast before. So yeah, there wasn't really much internet related stuff because it was really just the infancy of it. In fact, I went there for a degree in computer information and systems, and the first semester there, we were using command line interfaces, which, if you don't know, that's where you have to type. So if you want to file out my documents, you have to open up a command prompt and type, C:// my documents / the file.doc and hit enter, and then it would go search for it. And if the file was there, it would open it. So, like I said, it was just the infancy of the internet and technology being widely adopted by, America. So long story short, I guess it wasn't really much of a factor in our operations.
Martin, during your time at the Hudsonian, you uncovered more information about a student who died. What was that like, having to uncover that story?
Wow, this is actually bringing back a lot of memories and stuff. But as I understand it, as I remember it, we had gotten a tip, from, one of my reporters or editors had gotten a tip about someone who had committed suicide. And basically we were being blocked by essentially all sides and stuff. The school administration, was not going to help us out with this one. And, really it took, a lot of our reporters and stuff to kind of just speak to different people to get them to corroborate the story. And, my managing editor, Temba, was able to corroborate a good portion of that story through his sources and contacts and stuff. And, we were able to kind of get one of my reporters was able to get a police report, which we were able to use as the crux of the story. And so by the time we were able to publish this story, the next thing was, okay, how do we cover it? I mean, do we want to, I knew that, I didn't want to, plaster it on the front cover and sensationalize it. So there had to be a way to do it. And, eventually we decided to kind of we did eventually decide to put it on the front cover. But it came after, really kind of interesting side note to the story. So what I eventually found out earlier that day as we were about to publish was that our advisor, Rachel Bourne, and her other co-advisor, Matt Cantor, had apparently made a bet with each other, to try to figure out, whether we would ultimately make the decision to put this story on the front cover, or if we would try to hide it within the paper. And my initial decision was really to kind of just put it on like page 2 and stuff, because I don't think I really wanted to advertise it that much, because I was afraid of sensationalizing a suicide. So I was about to, I think I had already just sent out the paper to our publisher to print. And then, at the end of our meeting, Rachel had just come in and basically told me, all the reasons why, it isn't necessarily a good idea to bury this lead, that, essentially this is a story that, is in the public interest, and that, the readership should know about, and it should have, somewhat of a prominent place in it. So, I was able to send a quick email out, revise the paper, and, that story ended up going on the front cover, and, I'm pretty sure Rachel won that bet, but it kind of, it was a nice lesson for me and stuff that, really, you can't, even though you can't really try to sense what's going on and stuff. And, you have to report things as, unfiltered as you can be, because, you got to do this service for the readership. It's not really about how you feel. It's about presenting the facts as it really is, so that, the readers can make their own judgment.
Zach, during your time at the Hudsonian, you were a part of the YouTube channel that the Hudsonian owned. You can be seen in videos on that channel as the news editor and the editor-in-chief. Tell us a little bit about the conception behind that YouTube channel and a little bit more description about what you did there.
Yeah, I think that happens all the time. One that sticks out for me is we did an article about the lack of diversity in the administration in Hudson Valley and on the board, which we were very careful about and actually didn't get a ton of pushback on. But we were definitely, in the weeds a little bit with the administration when going through that process. And then I think on a lot of the times it was in the development of the story, like before it even went to print, where we get pushback if a reporter or someone was, asking questions or presenting their inquiry in a way that, made it seem like there was some kind of agenda or something like that. Some of the most severe pushback was actually before print for us. So there was one time where we had a reporter reach out to like every community college in the SUNY system asking for like crime data or something to do a comparison, but they did a poor job identifying themselves as someone who's working for the Hudsonian as opposed to a staff member of the college itself. So all these community colleges ended up calling the president of Hudson Valley, Drew Matnack, rest in peace to him, he's a great guy, and he ended up having to sit down with us at the Hudsonian and be like, what is going on? I've got all these calls in from community colleges all over the system. So yeah, I think if you're doing journalism well, you have to push limits and be willing to accept a certain amount of pushback. And hopefully, if you're doing it really well, those pushback, those mechanisms of pushback will show themselves before you actually print something.
Pat, as some of the other editors-in-chief have mentioned, being editor-in-chief doesn't always make you popular, as many of the stories often don't go over well with some of the people that are involved in those stories. Did you ever run into any situations where there were people that weren't happy with the way a story was portrayed?
Well, first of all, what that was highly embarrassing for me. But the funny thing about it is that, I'm very much a behind the scenes type of dude. I'm very into like cameras. I'm very much a nerd, and I don't have the fear of public speaking, but it's not like my go-to art form. So it was a big learning experience, because it's a lot more difficult to talk in front of a camera. I'm sure, John knows, as, a news anchor, like how difficult that job is. It is not easy at all. And I very quickly learned that you got to really be on top of it. As far as the conception behind it, I think that at the time, that was probably 2011, 2012, and we knew that YouTube was becoming a major player in the media industry. I don't think it was as big probably as it is now, obviously. I don't remember even exactly when YouTube came out, but our idea was like, hey, this, I think Kevin pointed out that you're pretty much running a small business. And as small business runners at the time, we were thinking, hey, let's go where the customers are. Everybody's on YouTube. So we knew that there was at least something to putting out some kind of broadcast media. People consume it very well. A lot of people watch it. So our idea was like, hey, not everybody's going to read the paper, but for those who don't, a lot of people are interested in YouTube. A lot of people are interested in watching more short form content. So it was a cool experience. We learned a lot from it. We worked with, at the time, Frank Appio was the director behind it. And then after a while, when the editor-in-chief reins kind of switched over to me, we worked with Louis Roldan. He was the photo editor of the Hudsonian. So he had the camera, he had the experience, he knew what he was doing. He was I would say he's a very passionate person. You could tell he really did care a lot about getting a good product, getting a good photo, getting a good video. So yeah, our conception behind it was just like, let's get more people watching this. Let's get more people as viewers, as readers. You go to the places where people are to get customers. And I think it's almost the same in a way as what you guys are doing with the podcast. Because now podcasts, they're huge. Like, I listen to podcasts all the time. And I can tell you that, I like this one. This is a good idea. So, while it wasn't probably the perfect thing, like, we didn't do the perfect job at it because, I didn't know what I was doing back then. It was still a great learning experience. I had a lot of fun with it. I'm sure there's some of it that's completely cringeworthy, that I wouldn't watch nowadays, but it was still a lot of fun, and I'm glad that I got to be part of that.
Rebecca, I'm told that you told future editor-in-chief Julio Rodriguez that he was, quote, EIC material, unquote. Did you give him any advice, and what got you to saying that?
I don't know if I remember that conversation, to be honest with you. So when I was editor-in-chief, obviously you look for the succession of the position and just trying to feel out the staff and see who would be good for it. And I mean, Julio definitely was a strong candidate. He was very involved in the paper. As I remember it, he was junior creative editor, I believe, for a while. And I mean, he definitely was a good candidate for it. Very bright kid, very involved in the paper. And I mean, that's really important because you don't want to elect someone as editor-in-chief and then have them leave or have them just kind of screw everything up. So he was good. I mean, the things you look for is obviously leadership, loyalty, involvement. If they're willing to be taught and willing to learn about the position and about the paper, writing and things like that. And I mean, he was smart. He knew what he was talking about, and he was a good candidate for it. We had a couple other people in the paper who would be good candidates as well, but I guess in the end, so I was editor-in-chief for only one semester. Due to my course load, I just didn't feel that I was giving the paper the time and effort that it deserved. So I did suggest that Jenny Caulfield become editor-in-chief after me, and she was elected to the position. So she handled it for the last semester that we were at Hudson Valley. So I'm assuming that she sort of mentored him on from there, and that's where he became editor-in-chief. But he was definitely a good candidate for it. So.
Jenny, you've said in the past that the Hudsonian created a number of great memories for you. What was your favorite memory from the Hudsonian?
So there is a student gala that they used to put on every year. The year that they had done it for us, it was in this very nice formal venue. I believe it was in Albany. And everyone had dressed up. There was catering. They had a raffle. They had awards, things like that. And all of us at the Hudsonian, we had all gone and we all sat together at our table. And I don't remember who it was, but someone on my staff had said as a joke, you know, something like, "Damn, Jenny, I wish you would do this for us." So I actually did on the last day of school. It was our final meeting. I bought everyone pizzas. We got a cake. I got sodas. I had asked one of our photographers to take photos, and I had actually went and I had made awards for every member on my e-board.
Oh, wow.
So I had and then framed the awards. And I actually remember making one. I asked Rebecca to come to the meeting, and I made her an award for Best Editor-in-Chief.
Aw.
But everyone got their award, and then we took a photo together with the award because that's what they did at the gala.
Yeah.
And everyone thought that was incredibly cute.
Julio, I understand you went to Cornell after graduating from Hudson Valley. Have you attended any of the clubs there? And if so, how do they compare to the Hudsonian?
To be completely honest, they do not come close to the Hudsonian. I think a lot of the clubs at Cornell were very much resume fillers, and that was certainly not the case with the Hudsonian. What we produced was a really good product, and I was very proud to be on the editorial board and to serve as the editor-in-chief, and I'm not entirely sure if that resonates with all of the other extracurriculars that are offered at Cornell. Like I said, they are very much just resume fillers. There's also the Daily Sun at Cornell, but having read their articles, I didn't feel particularly inclined to join their newspaper, just given their writing and editorial board and some of the pieces that they publish. But I think overwhelmingly my experience at the Hudsonian was unique, and I don't think that a lot of people coming from Cornell have that experience, and I kind of feel sad for them because I was able to meet all of these different people, and there was also the CMA conferences, which were insane. Just I went to Atlanta and Dallas and New York City twice, and I wouldn't have had that experience if I had gone to Cornell for 4 years, because there just wasn't anything here that was similar in nature to what the Hudsonian was producing and doing. And it's like mind-blowing to me that that the organization is at a community college and that it's so well funded, and that like that Hudson Valley has been able to provide that for students for generations.
Jay and Kevin, you two were kind of the brainchildren behind the idea of the podcast. What got you two to sitting down and saying, this is a good idea?
It came down to the conversation. People on campus thought it was an interesting concept. Several people on the Hudsonian staff thought it was something that, could thrive on campus. It was just kind of unanimously, well received. But it was just something I definitely could not have orchestrated. So 100% props to you for, being able to execute it and do it so well. I think you're doing a great job. Even with all the resources that we had, I didn't know the first thing of how to actually be able to get it going. What do you think, Kevin?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I know that there used to be a radio club at Hudson Valley, and they would do a radio program that would be broadcast throughout the school, and that used to be pretty successful from my understanding. And when I started thinking about it a little bit, we were talking about it, I thought, well, that used to be successful. I just know sitting around like in the newsroom, sometimes we just have really interesting conversations about things. And, you're kind of floating the idea that, well, what if we could get like a Hudsonian podcast, like pertaining to Hudson Valley, that would be kind of almost like, our first kind of thought was almost like the Joe Rogan experience, but like pertaining to Hudson Valley or something. And that was actually something that when I ran for EIC, that was like my main talking point, is that I wanted to start a podcast. But, once you get into the position of EIC, the realities of running a paper always kind of get in the way of your ambitions. And it ended up just being that thing that was just put on the back burner because there was always something more pressing. And, again, really props to you, Nolan, because this is something that, really wanted to see happen that we couldn't make happen. So, it's great though that that you're making it happen, like that's something that we always really wanted to see. So props to you.
Thank you. Abigail, with the semester winding down, what are some of the things you're hoping to accomplish next semester?
So I actually created a Google My Business account. And previously, anytime somebody would join the Hudsonian, they would do the first initial, last name, Hudsonian@gmail.com. And every individual person would have to create their own email. So this was actually something I was planning on discussing with student activities as soon as next week. I wanted the Hudsonian to get set up with a My Business domain name. In that way, we could manage and create email addresses as well as manage our location in Google Maps. And then that way we can actually promote the Hudsonian on Google. And that kind of opens up right now, in the past, if we wanted to do ad revenue, the business manager would seek an advertisement to be put in the newspaper. However, the newspaper is not active right now because campus is closed and classes are remote. So by affiliating ourselves with Google accounts, this opens a new form of ad revenue. And also this would help with our budget. The Hudsonian has reported earlier this semester that Hudson Valley has a $10 million deficit. And this was cutting the Hudsonian's budget was already on the table. And now with enrollment dropping, I'm even more concerned that it's going to occur. However, I'm hoping that they will table it because we are not currently publishing. And publishing the print newspaper was an expensive endeavor of the Hudsonian. So that's something I have in mind to accomplish over break, and then that we would fully initiate into the Hudsonian next semester.
Well, that about wraps up the first season finale of our podcast. I'd like to thank everyone here today. Some of you I worked with, but to everyone here, I'd like to thank you from the bottom of my heart for everything you've done for the Hudsonian and your devotion to journalism. I'd also like to speak to the listener for a moment. Thank you for bringing us into your homes this semester and making the HUD the success that it was. Make sure to tune in next month when a new season of the podcast will finally come to you. Thank you and good night. To read more about the following stories, make sure to head over to thehudsonian.org for the latest on-campus news from the Hudsonian, and make sure to listen to new episodes of The HUD every Monday.